power, privilege, a life of gilded luxury. Then, in a flash, it all vanished. The Habsburgs, rulers of a vast empire, for centuries, found their world crashing down. But for some, the end of an empire was just the beginning of a truly wild ride. They lost their crowns, but they found new paths, some stranger than fiction. Get ready to dive into the lives of 5 Habsburgs who went from palaces to unexpected adventures, proving that sometimes losing everything is just the first step to becoming unforgettable. Number 5. The archduke who endured hell and held his head high. Maximilian Eugen Hohenberg was born into a life that was already complicated. His father, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was the heir to the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire. But his marriage was what the old royal rule books called morganatic. This meant Franz Ferdinand had married Sophie Chotek, a countess, but not of royal blood. The rules declared their children, including young Max, could not inherit the throne. They were Hohenbergs, not Habsburgs. In the eyes of the imperial court, from the moment of his birth in 1902, Max lived under a cloud of controversy and a slightly lower status than other Habsburg princes. His parents fought tirelessly to give him and his siblings a normal life, a true home, even amidst the grandeur of their palaces like Konopist and Artstetten. They were devoted parents, and Max experienced a childhood filled with love, even if it lacked the ultimate royal designation. Then came June 28, 1914. Max was only 12 years old when a bullet in Sarajevo shattered his family and ignited a world war. His beloved father, Franz Ferdinand, and his mother, Sophie, were assassinated. The world reeled. For Max and his siblings, Sophie and Ernst, their world collapsed entirely. They became orphans, their lives irrevocably altered. Their imperial connection, once a source of their complex status, now marked them as figures of global tragedy. Emperor Franz Joseph took them under his wing, providing for them, but the warmth of their own family was gone forever. The war raged for 4 long years, tearing Europe apart. When it finally ended in 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the very foundation of the Habsburgs' power for centuries, crumbled. The monarchy was abolished. Max, who had grown up in the shadow of an empire, now found himself an ordinary citizen. In the new Republic of Austria, the palaces they had known, the estates that had been their homes, were now public property. Max and his siblings were no longer archdukes and duchesses in the traditional sense. They were simply Herr and Frau Hohenberg. It was a dizzying transformation, a stripping away of centuries of tradition and privilege. Max, however, was not one to wallow in self-pity. He embraced his new reality with dignity. He studied law, eventually becoming a lawyer. He married Countess Elisabeth von Waldberg, Zwölfig und Waldsee, and they had 6 sons. Max dedicated himself to managing the family properties that remained, particularly Artstetten Castle, which held his parents' tomb. He became a guardian of their memory, a quiet caretaker of a lost world. His life was focused on his family, his work, and maintaining a sense of normalcy in a world that had been anything but normal for him. But the peace was not to last. In the 1930s, a dark shadow began to creep across Europe. Nazism. Adolf Hitler's Germany grew increasingly powerful and aggressive. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, an event known as the Anschluss, Max Hohenberg found himself in grave danger. He was an outspoken opponent of the Nazis, a man who believed in a free and independent Austria, not one dominated by Hitler. His family name, even stripped of its royal titles, still carried weight, and his anti-Nazi stance was well known. Max, along with his younger brother Ernst, refused to swear allegiance to Hitler. They were seen as a threat, as symbols of resistance. However quiet their opposition may have been, the consequences were swift and brutal. In March 1938, Max and Ernst Hohenberg were arrested by the Gestapo. They were first held in Vienna, then transferred to the horrors of the Dachau concentration camp. Dachau was one of the first and most brutal Nazi concentration camps, a place of unspeakable cruelty and suffering. For Max, A man accustomed to a life of privilege, however complex, this was a descent into an unimaginable hell. He was stripped of his identity, forced into hard labor, subjected to starvation, torture, and constant humiliation. The conditions were horrific, designed to break the human spirit. Later, Max was transferred to another infamous concentration camp, Flossenburg, near the German-Czechoslovakian border. There he continued to endure the brutal regime. Facing daily threats to his life, he witnessed unimaginable atrocities. Yet, through it all, Max Hohenberg maintained a remarkable resilience. Survivors of the camps often spoke of the importance of small acts of defiance, of holding on to one's humanity. For Max, simply surviving each day, refusing to be broken, was an act of profound courage. He was a prince in all but title, reduced to a number, yet he held on to his inner strength. Max Hohenberg somehow survived the war, a testament to his indomitable spirit. He was eventually liberated from Flossenburg in 1945 by American forces. His body was emaciated, his health severely compromised by the years of deprivation and abuse. But his spirit was unbroken. Returning to a devastated Austria, Max worked to rebuild his life and contribute to his country's recovery. He became an advocate for other victims of Nazi persecution, sharing his experiences to ensure that such horrors would never be forgotten. He continued to manage Artstetten Castle, ensuring his parents' resting place was cared for, and that their story and the story of the lost empire was preserved. Max Hohenberg lived until 1962, a quiet hero who had faced down tyranny and survived. His life was not one of grand political maneuvering or public spectacle after the fall of the empire. Instead, it was a profound testament to personal integrity and resilience. He had lost the status he never truly had in the first place, but gained an unbreakable dignity, forged in the fires of World War II. He was a Habsburg who found his true nobility not in a crown, but in his unwavering character, even when everything he knew was stripped away and he faced the very worst of humanity. Number 4. The tragic emperor who chased a distant dream. Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph Maria, Archduke of Austria, was born in 1832, a prince of the mighty Habsburg dynasty. He was the younger brother of Franz Joseph, the man who would become Emperor of Austria. Maximilian grew up in the grand palaces of Vienna, surrounded by art, music, and intellectual pursuits. Unlike his older brother, who was destined for the throne and its heavy responsibilities, Maximilian was free to pursue his passions. He was charming, intelligent, and highly educated, with a deep love for botany, exploration, and the sea. He joined the Austrian Navy quickly, rising through the ranks, and even embarked on scientific expeditions around the world. He dreamed of a life of adventure, perhaps even leading his own scientific colony in the distant Americas. He was a romantic, often seen as sensitive and idealistic qualities that would both inspire and ultimately betray him. In 1857, Maximilian married Princess Charlotte of Belgium, known as Carlotta. She was spirited, ambitious, and equally drawn to a grander destiny than merely being an archduchess. Together they made a formidable, if somewhat naive couple, both yearning for a stage larger than the one afforded to them in the shadows of the Austrian imperial court. Maximilian served as the Governor-General of Lombardy, Venetia, a Habsburg territory in Italy, but his liberal ideas often clashed with the more conservative policies of his brother, Emperor Franz Joseph. Maximilian felt restless, unfulfilled, and yearned for a truly meaningful role, a chance to make a lasting impact on the world. Then, a most extraordinary offer arrived. In the early 1860s, France, under the ambitious Emperor Napoleon III, had intervened in Mexico. Mexico was embroiled in civil war with a conservative faction, seeking a European monarch to bring order and stability. Napoleon III, eager to expand French influence in the Americas, saw an opportunity. He proposed to Maximilian that he become the Emperor of Mexico. It was a stunning proposition, a chance to rule an entire empire, vast and exotic. Across the ocean, Maximilian was initially hesitant. He knew little of Mexico, its volatile politics, or the true extent of the French involvement, but the allure of an imperial crown. Of fulfilling his idealistic dreams of enlightened rule was powerful. Carlota, his wife, was particularly enthusiastic, seeing it as their true calling. Despite warnings from his brother and others who saw the venture as incredibly risky, Maximilian, swayed by the promise of popular support and the backing of France, accepted the Mexican crown in 1864. He formally renounced his rights to the Austrian throne, severing his ties to his homeland, and set sail for his new empire. This was his great exile, a voluntary departure from Europe to embrace a destiny that few could have ever predicted. Upon arriving in Mexico, Maximilian and Carlota were greeted with some fanfare, but the reality was far from the grand vision they had imagined. Mexico was a land deeply divided. While the conservative faction supported him, the liberal forces led by Benito Juarez steadfastly refused to recognize his rule. The French military provided his main support, but Juarez and his forces waged a relentless guerrilla war. Maximilian, true to his idealistic nature, tried to implement progressive reforms. He supported land reforms, abolished debt peonage, restricted working hours, and even tried to protect indigenous rights. These policies, however, alienated the very conservatives who had brought him to power. He was an outsider trying to impose European ideals on a nation with its own complex history and political struggles. The situation grew increasingly desperate. The American Civil War ended in 1865, and the United States, committed to the Monroe Doctrine, began to pressure France to withdraw its troops from Mexico. Napoleon III, facing growing troubles at home and realizing the futility of the Mexican venture, began to pull his forces out in 1866. This was a devastating blow to Maximilian. Without French military support, his empire was doomed. Carlota, desperate, embarked on a frantic and ultimately futile journey to Europe, pleading for aid from Napoleon III and even the Pope. Her pleas were ignored, and the immense stress tragically led to her suffering a mental breakdown from which she never fully recovered. Maximilian considered abdicating and returning to Austria, but his pride and a misguided sense of duty prevented him. He believed it would be dishonorable to abandon the people who had supported him. He remained in Mexico, bravely leading his dwindling loyal forces, even as the liberal army under Juarez closed in. He was captured in Querétaro in May 1867. A military court sentenced him to death. Despite international appeals from European royalty, and even Victor Hugo Juarez, determined to establish the principle of national sovereignty and prevent future foreign interventions, refused to pardon him. On June 19, 1867, Maximilian, along with two of his loyal Mexican generals, Miramon and Mejia, faced a firing squad on the Hill of the Bells. He faced his execution with remarkable courage and dignity. His last words, spoken in Spanish, were for Mexico. "Mexicans, may my blood be the last shed for the prosperity of the country. And if it should have to flow again, may it flow for a good cause and not for ignoco." And his death sent shockwaves across Europe, a brutal end to a dreamlike adventure, a tragic warning about the perils of imperial ambition and intervention. Maximilian's life was a grand theatrical tragedy. He was a romantic idealist, perhaps too naive for the harsh realities of international politics and nation-building. His exile was not forced by the fall of an empire, but a self-imposed departure, driven by ambition and a longing for purpose. He was a Habsburg prince who became an emperor in a distant land, only to lose his life in a quest that was ultimately not his own. His story remains one of the most compelling and cautionary tales in royal history, a testament to the allure of power and the devastating consequences of a dream gone terribly wrong. He was a remarkable figure, not for what he achieved, but for the sheer audacity of his journey and the tragic dignity of his end. Number 3. The Crown Prince who built a future, not a past. Otto von Habsburg was born into a paradox. On November 20th, 1912, he entered the world as Archduke Otto of Austria, heir apparent to one of Europe's oldest and most powerful dynasties, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His great-granduncle, the venerable Emperor Franz Joseph, still reigned. Otto is destined to one day wear the crown of Austria and Hungary. Yet he was only 6 years old when that world, his birthright, vanished forever. The First World War ended in 1918 and the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, giving way to new republics. His father, Emperor Charles I, was forced to renounce participation in state affairs, effectively abdicating. The Habsburg family was exiled. Otto's childhood. From Vienna, his family moved to Switzerland, then to the island of Madeira in the Atlantic. It was on Madeira that his father, Charles I, died in 1922, a broken man, leaving Otto, a boy of 9, as the titular head of the House of Habsburg. It was an immense burden for a child inheriting a claim to a throne that no longer existed, a legacy of power and history in an era that rejected it. His mother, Empress Zita, became his guiding force, ensuring he received a rigorous education, instilling in him a deep sense of duty, history, and a modern understanding of the world. He learned multiple languages, studied history, law, and social sciences, always preparing for a future that was increasingly uncertain. As he grew older, Otto faced the difficult choice of whether to actively pursue the restoration of the monarchy. For many years, he was seen as a pretender to the throne, a symbol of a bygone era. He spent his youth in various European countries, including Spain and Belgium, always watchful, always learning. But Otto was far from a relic of the past. He was a forward-thinking intellectual, profoundly affected by the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 1930s. He became a staunch opponent of Nazism and communism, seeing them as threats to the very fabric of European civilization. During World War II, he spoke out against Hitler's regime, even attempting to influence Allied powers to prevent the Nazi annexation of Austria. He maintained secret contacts with figures in the United States, advocating for a free and independent Austria. After the war with Europe, shattered and divided by the Iron Curtain, Otto von Habsburg made a pivotal decision. He realized that the era of traditional monarchies was over. His true calling, he believed, was not to restore a past empire, but to help build a new unified Europe. In 1961, after years of complex negotiations and political maneuvering, Otto renounced his claims to the Austrian throne. This was not a surrender, but a strategic move. It allowed him to return to Austria, a country he had been forbidden to enter since 1919. It also cleared his path for a new kind of public service. This decision marked the true beginning of his remarkable second act. Otto dedicated himself to the cause of European integration. He became a leading figure in the Pan-European Union, an organization dedicated to European unity. In 1979, he was elected to the European Parliament, representing a Bavarian constituency in Germany. He served for an astonishing 20 years until 1999, becoming one of its most respected and influential members. In Parliament, he was a tireless champion of human rights, democracy, and the expansion of the European Union, particularly into the former communist countries of Eastern Europe. He used his historical knowledge, his multilingualism, and his unique perspective as a former royal to bridge divides and foster cooperations. One of his most significant contributions came in 1989. Otto von Habsburg was instrumental in organizing the Pan-European picnic on the Austro-Hungarian border. This event, which allowed hundreds of East Germans to cross freely into Austria, effectively creating a temporary hole in the Iron Curtain, is widely considered a symbolic act that contributed to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. It was a powerful moment, orchestrated by a man who had once been destined for a throne, now working to dismantle barriers and unite a continent. Otto von Habsburg lived a long and incredibly upheaval life, passing away in 2011 at the age of 98. His funeral in Vienna was a grand affair, reflecting the respect he had earned, not as a monarch, but as a statesman and a visionary. He transformed his exile from a curse into a unique advantage, giving him a broader perspective on history and politics. He proved that true leadership does not require a crown, but rather dedication, intellect, and of her fond commitment to peace and freedom. He was a Habsburg who looked forward, not backward, and whose legacy is woven into the very fabric of modern Europe. Number 2. The Empress who held her family and faith against all odds. Zita of Bourbon-Parma was born into royalty, a princess of one of Europe's most ancient and prolific noble families. Her childhood was filled with the usual comforts and strictures of aristocratic life, but it was also marked by a strong sense of faith and family values instilled by her devout parents. In 1911, she married Archduke Charles, a man she deeply loved and who would unexpectedly become the last emperor of Austria and king of Hungary. Their marriage was a true love match, a rarity in royal circles, and they quickly had a growing family, starting with their first son, Otto, born in 1912. Their world changed dramatically and swiftly. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Charles's uncle, propelled Charles much closer to the throne. Then, in 1916, Emperor Franz Joseph died, and Charles ascended to power, making Zita Empress. Their reign was short and tumultuous, overshadowed by the devastating First World War. Zita worked tirelessly alongside her husband, advocating for peace, social welfare, and efforts to alleviate suffering. They shared a deep devotion to their people and their faith, trying to navigate the impossible currents of a collapsing empire. But the war was lost and the empire crumbled. In November 1918, Charles was forced to renounce participation in state affairs. The monarchy was abolished. The imperial family was now an unwanted symbol of a bygone era. They were exiled, forbidden from remaining in Austria. This marked the beginning of Zita's long and arduous journey as an empress without an empire, a devoted wife and mother. Their first destination was Switzerland. Here, Zita clung to her family and faith. Charles, however, could not accept the loss of his throne. He made two brave, desperate attempts to regain his Hungarian crown in 1921, known as the Easter Offensive and the Autumn Offensive. Zita, ever loyal, supported him fully, even joining him on his second ill-fated venture. Both attempts failed, and the consequences were severe. The Allied powers, determined to prevent any return of the Habsburgs, decided to move the family even further away to the remote Portuguese island of Madeira. Life on Madeira was a harsh contrast to the palaces they had once known. The family lived in relative poverty, often struggling to make ends meet. The climate was damp and challenging. Then, tragedy struck again. In April 1922, Emperor Charles, weakened by the privations of exile and a demanding life, contracted pneumonia and died at the age of just 34. Zita was left a widow at 29, with 8 young children. The youngest only 4 months old. It was a crushing blow, leaving her heartbroken and utterly alone to raise her large family. But Zita's resilience was extraordinary. She vowed to fulfill her husband's last wish, to raise their children to be worthy of their heritage, and to uphold their faith. She moved her family from Madeira to various locations in Spain, then Belgium, and eventually Canada during World War II, always seeking safety and suitable education for her children. Despite their greatly reduced circumstances, she ensured they received a top-tier education. Often doing the teaching herself, she instilled in them a profound sense of duty, a deep Catholic faith, and a love for Austria. Even though they could not return, Zita lived a life of unwavering principle. She never remarried, dedicating herself entirely to her children and the memory of her husband, whom she deeply believed had been a saint. She actively championed his beatification, cause a testament to her faith and devotion. She lived simply, often in humble circumstances compared to her royal upbringing, yet always maintained her dignity and regal bearing. She never fully abandoned the hope of a Habsburg restoration, but her primary focus remained on her family. For decades, she was forbidden from setting foot in Austria. It was only in 1982, after the Austrian government lifted the ban, that the nearly 90-year-old Empress Zita finally returned to her homeland for a brief, emotional visit. It was a momentous occasion, a recognition of her long and dignified exile. She passed away in 1989 at the remarkable age of 96, having outlived many of her children. Empress Zita's funeral in Vienna was a grand event, attended by royalty and dignitaries from around the world. It was a final testament to her enduring legacy, not as a reigning monarch, but as a symbol of strength, faith, and unwavering devotion. She had faced unimaginable loss, poverty, and displacement, yet she never faltered in her duties as a mother or her deep-seated beliefs. Her life in exile was a testament to the power of human spirit, a remarkable journey of a woman who held her family and her faith above all else, even as the world around her crumbled. Number 1. The Emperor who died for peace and became a saint. Charles. Franz Joseph was not born to be an emperor. He was the nephew of the mighty Emperor Franz Joseph, and the second in line to the throne behind his uncle, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Charles grew up as a quiet, dutiful young man, more interested in his family and his Catholic faith than in the trappings of power. He served in the army, lived a relatively modest life for a prince, and found deep happiness in his marriage to Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parma in 1911. They were a devoted couple, quickly starting a family, blissfully unaware of the immense destiny that awaited them. Then on June 28, 1914, the unthinkable happened. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, plunging Europe into what would become the First World War. Charles suddenly and unexpectedly became the heir apparent. 2 years later, in November 1916, the ancient Emperor Franz Joseph died, and Charles, at the young age of 29, ascended to the thrones of Austria and Hungary. He became Emperor Charles I and King Charles IV, inheriting a vast, multi-ethnic empire that was already crumbling under the weight of a brutal, unending war. Charles's reign was short, lasting only 2 years, but he poured every ounce of his energy into trying to bring peace to his war-torn lands. He was the only head of state among the warring powers to actively pursue peace initiatives, often secretly, against the wishes of his own military and allies. He believed the war was a moral catastrophe and worked tirelessly to find a diplomatic solution. He also tried to implement significant social reforms, including protecting workers and establishing a ministry of social welfare, even amidst the chaos of war. He was a deeply compassionate ruler, but he faced impossible odds. His efforts for peace failed, and the empire, exhausted by war, began to disintegrate from within. By October 1918, the war was lost and the empire was dissolving. In November, Charles issued a proclamation, a carefully worded statement, in which he renounced participation in state affairs. It was not an abdication, as he refused to give up his God-given right to rule, but a recognition that he could no longer exercise power. The new Republic of Austria was declared, and the Habsburg family was effectively exiled. Charles Zita and their growing family first went to Switzerland. But Charles could not let go of his duty to his peoples. He believed his oath to God and his subjects meant he must try to restore order. In 1921, he made 2 bold, desperate attempts to regain his crown in Hungary. He saw himself as the legitimate ruler, the only one who could truly bring stability back to the region. His first attempt in March, known as the Easter Offensive, failed quickly due to lack of support. His second attempt, the Autumn Offensive, in October brought him closer to Budapest, but again, forces against him, both internal and external, proved too strong. These attempts were seen as dangerous by the Allied powers, who feared a restoration of the Habsburgs would destabilize Europe further. As a result of these efforts, Charles and his family were exiled even further to the remote Portuguese island of Madeira in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It was meant to be a place of isolation where he could no longer pose a threat to the new European order. Their life on Madeira was one of stark deprivation. From the opulence of Vienna, they were reduced to living in a rented villa, often without proper heating or food. Charles, always a man of principle, refused to accept offers of financial aid that would compromise his royal dignity or his claims. He was a broken man, but his faith remained unshaken. The harsh conditions and the immense stress of his exile took a terrible toll on his health. In March 1922, Charles caught a severe cold which quickly developed into pneumonia. Without adequate medical care or nourishment, his condition worsened rapidly. He died on April 1st, 1922, at the incredibly young age of 34, leaving behind his grieving wife and 8 young children. His last words were of faith and devotion, enduring his suffering with remarkable courage. The story of Charles I, however, did not end with his death. Decades later, a movement began within the Catholic Church to recognize his exceptional life and virtues. His tireless efforts for peace during the war, his deep personal piety, his compassion for the poor, and his suffering in exile were all examined. Many believed he had lived a life of heroic virtue, demonstrating a profound commitment to his faith and his people, even in the most challenging circumstances. In 2004, Pope John Paul II beatified him, declaring him Blessed Charles of Austria. He is now recognized as a patron of peace, and his feast day is celebrated annually. Charles I's life was a tragic paradox. A man of peace thrust into the heart of war, a compassionate ruler who lost his empire, an emperor in exile who died in poverty. His exile was not a quest for adventure or a new beginning, but a forced removal from his homeland and his duties. Yet, through it all, he maintained his integrity, his faith, and his unwavering dedication to what he believed was right. He was a Habsburg who endured profound loss and suffering, ultimately finding an enduring legacy, not in power, but in his personal virtue and his remarkable journey toward sainthood.